Obama wanted to make Kennedy look like an old fool, but in return, he heard the truth he feared. The air in the grand hall at the Aspen Institute was thin and expensive, smelling faintly of cedar and self-congratulation. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood in silent, majestic judgment, but inside, judgment was a far more active, intellectual sport. This was the annual dialogue on democracy's future, a gathering of the global cognitive elite. Tech billionaires with messiah complexes mingled with Pulitzer-winning journalists, Nobel laureates, and the sleek, influential architects of policy and culture. It was a room that vibrated with a unified belief in its own power to shape the world, a consensus built on data, progress, and a shared, unspoken disdain for the simpler, messier truths of the past. At the center of this universe, holding court without even trying, was Barack Obama. He was no longer president, but he had lost none of the aura. He moved with a relaxed, languid grace, his smile both warm and knowing. He was the high priest of nuanced, forward-thinking rationalism, and this was his congregation. Seated a few chairs down the long, white table on the stage was Senator John Neely Kennedy. He was the designated counterpoint, the scheduled dissent. To the majority of the room, he was a curiosity, a political artifact from a part of the country they flew over but never truly considered. His presence was a nod to ideological diversity, but one made with the confident assumption that his views would be elegantly dismantled and rendered obsolete by the end of the session. He was the dinosaur invited to a symposium on the future of mammals. The moderator, a famous cable news anchor with a PhD in political theory, opened the discussion with a sweeping, portentous question about the challenges facing liberal democracy in an age of misinformation and polarization. The first several speakers offered variations on a theme: the need for better algorithms, more robust global institutions, and a renewed commitment to fact-based discourse. Then, the moderator turned to the 44th president. Obama leaned into his microphone, and a hush fell over the hall. He spoke with the familiar, hypnotic cadence that had once captivated a nation. He spoke of complexity, of the need to move beyond old, rigid binaries. He painted a picture of a future that required a new kind of political consciousness, one untethered from what he called the gravitational pull of antiquated moral frameworks. He paused, a wry, almost pitying smile playing on his lips as his eyes flickered for a moment towards the senator from Louisiana. "The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice," he said, quoting King, but adding his own spin. "And it doesn't bend by standing still. It bends because people have the courage to evolve, to let go of old certainties. We simply cannot solve 21st century problems with 19th century thinking. We must be wary of the well-meaning but ultimately obstructive voices of nostalgia, the political and moral dinosaurs who would have us believe that the best way forward is to go back." The room erupted in appreciative, sophisticated laughter and applause. It was a perfect Obama line, intellectually sharp, gracefully dismissive, and devastatingly effective. The message was clear. John Kennedy was not just wrong, he was irrelevant. The moderator, beaming, turned to Kennedy. "Senator," she said, her tone dripping with a barely concealed challenge, a response. "President Obama makes a powerful case for evolution. How do you answer the charge that your brand of conservatism, rooted in traditional values, is perhaps unequipped for the future we now face?" All eyes were on him. The collective expectation was for a defensive, perhaps angry, retort, a predictable volley of partisan talking points that would only serve to prove Obama's point. They were expecting a roar from the dinosaur. Instead, Kennedy leaned forward with the unhurried calm of a man sitting on his own front porch. His gaze wasn't fixed on Obama or the moderator, but seemed to scan the faces in the audience, acknowledging them as individuals rather than a monolithic elite. "That was a mighty eloquent speech, Mr. President," he began, his Louisiana drawl a stark contrast to the crisp, accentless English that had filled the hall. "And I agree, the world is a complicated place. But I find that when I get lost in the woods, the best thing to do isn't to run faster into the unknown. It's to find a landmark you can trust. A tall tree, a North Star, something that doesn't change with the weather." He paused, letting the simple metaphor hang in the air. "You speak of progress, and I am for progress. But what is it we are progressing towards? A ship without a rudder is still moving. You can call it progress, but you might just be moving toward the rocks. It seems to me the most important question isn't how fast we are going, but whether we still have a map and a compass. Obama's smile remained, but it had lost some of its warmth. Kennedy had refused the bait. He hadn't defended his brand of conservatism. He had questioned the very definition of progress. The former president leaned back into the microphone, adopting the patient tone of a professor correcting a promising but misguided student. With all due respect, Senator, that's a false choice. The map and compass you're talking about were drawn for a different world. They don't account for climate change, for artificial intelligence, for the interconnected global economy. To insist on using them is not wisdom, it's a failure of imagination. We need new tools, new maps. Clinging to an old moral absolutism in a world of profound gray areas can be a dangerous form of paralysis. It prevents the very compromises and pragmatic solutions that real-world governance requires. It's one thing to talk about a North Star in the abstract. It's another when you're trying to negotiate a multilateral climate accord or regulate genetic engineering. Sometimes, Senator, the most moral thing you can do is to be pragmatic. The intellectual trap was reset, and this time it was more sophisticated. He was painting Kennedy's worldview not just as old, but as actively harmful, a beautiful but useless relic that stood in the way of saving the planet. He was making conscience the enemy of consequence. A long silence settled over the stage. Kennedy looked down at his hands, then back up, first at Obama, then at the audience. He seemed to be making a decision. The intellectual thrust and parry was over. It was time for a different approach. Mr. President, your argument is seamless. It is logical. And on its own terms, it is nearly impossible to refute. So, if you and the moderator will indulge me, I'd like to stop arguing and, instead, tell a story. A ripple of confusion went through the audience. A story? Here, at the Aspen Dialogue? It was a tactical shift so unexpected it was disarming. Obama, trapped by the decorum of the event, could only nod, a gesture of magnanimous curiosity that barely masked his surprise. There was a town, Kennedy began, his voice dropping into a storyteller's cadence, not a real town on a map, but a town of the heart. Let's call it Harmony. In the center of Harmony's town square stood a very old church with a very old bell tower. And in that tower was a bell. It wasn't a perfect bell. It had a tiny, hairline crack, so its tone was never quite pure. It was a little flat on the G-sharp. And the man who rang it, old Mr. Abernathy, had arthritis, so he didn't always ring it at the precise top of the hour. Sometimes he was a minute early, sometimes 2 minutes late. But that bell, Kennedy continued, his voice resonating with a strange power in the acoustically perfect hall, was the town's heartbeat. Its flawed, slightly off-key chime was the sound of waking up, of lunch break, of sunset. When a child was born, Mr. Abernathy would ring it in a joyful, tumbling peal. When someone passed, he would toll it slow and solemn, each note a tear. And when there was a danger, a fire in the dry season, a flood coming up from the river, he would ring it with a frantic, desperate clangor that was not a sound, but a scream. A call to action. The sound of that flawed bell, rung by a flawed man, meant something. It was woven into the life of the town. It was their shared language. Their conscience. It didn't just tell them the time, it told them who they were. The audience was utterly still. They had forgotten they were at a political symposium. They were in the town of Harmony, listening to a bell. Then, a new generation came to run the town council. They were smart, educated people who had been to places like this. They had degrees. And they looked at the old bell and saw only its imperfections. The crack, the off-key tone, Mr. Abernathy's unreliable timing. It was inefficient. It was, they said, outdated. So they formed a committee, secured a grant, and replaced it. They installed a brand new, state-of-the-art digital carillon system, imported from Germany. It was perfect. Its tones were crystal clear, tuned to the millihertz. It was synchronized to the atomic clock in Boulder. It never missed a second. Kennedy paused, letting the image of sterile perfection settle. The new chimes were beautiful, and they were precise. But they were hollow. The sound marked the hours, but it didn't touch the heart. It was information without soul. And then, one night, a fire started in the old lumber mill on the edge of town. The new system performed its function perfectly. At precisely 2 a.m., it broadcast its pre-programmed, digitally recorded emergency alarm, a clean, loud, technically flawless siren. But the people of Harmony, sleeping in their beds, heard it not as a call, but as a noise. It was just another sound in a world full of sounds. It wasn't Mr. Abernathy's frantic, Human scream. It was a machine telling them there was a problem. It didn't compel them to leap out of bed, to grab a bucket, to run toward the danger to help their neighbors. They waited for the official fire department, the professionals, to handle it. The fire raged, and a part of the town was lost that never would have been before. He stopped. The story finished. The silence in the hall was profound. It was the silence of 1,000 people holding their breath. Kennedy slowly raised his eyes and looked directly at Barack Obama. The folksy storyteller was gone, replaced by the quiet intensity of a prophet. Mr. President, you and these good people are the new town council of harmony. You are brilliant, you are well-intentioned, and you are dedicated to progress. But in your quest for a more perfect, efficient, and rational world, you are tearing down the old bells. You are replacing the flawed, cracked, but deeply human conscience of our nation with a flawless, digital system of data points, algorithms, and political pragmatism. You talk of democracy's future, but you have forgotten what makes a citizen. A citizen isn't a data point. A citizen is a person who, when he hears the bell of his neighbor's house on fire, runs to help, not because a system tells him to, but because a conscience inside him screams. We have become a nation of people who hear the alarm, but wait for someone else to act. We have the most sophisticated tools for communication in human history, but we have lost our shared language. The problem is not that we are using an old map. The problem is we have forgotten that the purpose of the map is to lead us home, and we have forgotten what home feels like. Then, a final, quiet turn. He looked out at the sea of powerful faces, and his voice was filled not with accusation, but with a deep and aching sadness. You wanted to know if my way of thinking is outdated. But the real question is this: what good is your perfect clock if there is no one left who will answer the bell? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. And in that moment, the room changed. People didn't look at Kennedy. They didn't look at Obama. They looked down at their own hands. A tech CEO, whose company designed algorithms to predict human behavior, suddenly saw the hollowness of his own creation. A journalist, who had spent a career deconstructing motives with cynical precision, felt a sudden, unfamiliar pang of sincerity. A young activist, so sure of her righteous cause, wondered if she had ever truly listened to the people she claimed to be fighting for. The applause, when it started, was not for Kennedy. It was a slow, staggered, deeply personal sound. It was the sound of 1,000 people applauding a truth they had just recognized in themselves. It was the sound of a room full of sleeping citizens, suddenly, terribly, and hopefully, awake.